Excellent. Okay, as I said, I'm John Fisher, I'm the manager of Bushland, and my job first up, first presentation is really to do my traditional shock and awe presentation. And looking around the room, probably a number of people have had a lot of history in Hobart, so the issues of 1967 are probably close to people's recollections of Hobart. So I suppose the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what's the likelihood of bushfire in Hobart? And my answer to that is, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. There will be a major bushfire impact upon this city. It has in the past and it will in the future. The question is, how do we deal with it? How do we prepare for it? And importantly, do we know what to do when it does occur so that we can demonstrate that we've learnt the lessons of history? There have been, I think, over 40 separate inquiries since 1939 in the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. And Alan Stretton's words from the Royal Commission then still ring true today in terms of the response of the community. Some of the issues that are apparent in that is, the catastrophic loss of property, the disruption to economy, the disruption to people's lives, the loss of life, obviously, and the reasons for that are well understood, I think, in Australia and across the world. But the question is, have we learnt those lessons? In terms of scale, you just have to understand that the City of Hobart is in a particularly precarious position. 75% of the city is covered by the bushfire-prone area overlay, which indicates that 75% of the city, the LGA, is within 100 metres of a patch of bush greater than 1 hectare in size. That's pretty impressive for a capital city. I haven't looked at, and I should know because I was a deputy chief there for a number of years, but I'd be interested to see whether that challenges even Canberra, which has the Walter Burley Griffin's legacy of the ridgelines running into Canberra, which as a fire service always thought was a great service to the fire service because it brought the potential bushfires right into the heart of the city. In 2002, threatened Government House, which was really quite bizarre from us. I suppose the question that I would put is that on the 7th of February 1967, the bushfires that we had in Hobart, which really still poses the greatest impact upon settlement in Australia, $44 million in 1967 terms, and it impacted upon over 1,293 homes and 1,700 buildings. It had Hobart Firepath now would impact upon twice that number of lots. When I say lots, I mean subdividable properties, not necessarily houses. So the number of houses impacted by that firepath would be significantly greater, more than double. At that time, the population of Hobart was 129,000, and as you can see, it's over 269,000 now. So the number of people impacted would be more than double. What's made that happen is the fact that farms have been converted into subdivided properties, that large properties have been subdivided into multiple dwellings or multiple lots. So therefore we've promulgated ourselves out into the bushland. We've populated areas in 67 where only bush, farms, dairies, orchards are now houses. Native gardens, importantly, since 67, when the English type gardens were probably the prominent backyard or front yard. Now we're looking at the native gardens, which form a blanket across the city and allow the penetration of fire quite a long way into the city itself. Importantly, a lot of houses that were built after the introduction of the Australian Standard 3959 in 2009 actually have responded to bushfire risk. Building in bushfire-prone areas is part of the planning schemes across Australia, but we have a legacy housing stock that was built before then, and it doesn't benefit from the lessons we learned from 2009 in Victoria. Places like Tolman's Hill, for example, is a subdivision in 96, and houses built since 2009 have to comply with that standard. But there are inherent issues with the subdivision itself, which cause problems for people who are living in that area in terms of escape routes, etc. The extension of residential subdivision has made it difficult for us to really address bushfire risk, because we've built into areas that were seriously affected by the 67 event. 67 event started at Kiln Gully about midday. There were 110 fires across Tassie on that day, as you may know. It was a catastrophic day. It was horrendous. The wind speed and the temperature and the relative humidity was such that control of that fire was never going to be possible. The fire extended from Kiln Gully from under a northwesterly wind and headed towards Taroona. There were a couple of fires occurring that day. One, as you can see, is marked there in Kiln Gully in the centre of the screen. That monstrosity on your left-hand side was the Sleeping Beauty fire, another very significant fire that came across the back of Wellington Range and impacted upon the city. And if Kiln Gully had not occurred, then I'm sure that Sleeping Beauty would have done the job. Another fire started up to the north of Glenorchy, as you can see as well. But what's really interesting is that the Sleeping Beauty fire, I proposed through embers into the city, into Ferntree and other areas, Leslie Vale, etc. And therefore, it wasn't just one fire that you were dealing with, it was a number of fires that sourced from that initial event. So when you look at 2:30 in the afternoon, 2.5 hours after the initial fire was detected, these fires had pretty much covered the landscape. They had threatened Ferntree. It's interesting when people look to the northwestern Ferntree, in actual fact, the major impact upon Ferntree was from a spot fire that landed to the south of that town. And you can see that the run of fire from the Kiln Gully fire right through to Mount Nelson, went through areas like Tolman's Hill and Mount Nelson that are now fully developed. This is at 1800 when it had reached Taroona. So from 12 o'clock to 1800, this fire did massive amount of damage. It's probably the single greatest event in loss of life. 64 people were perished in that, 900 injured, 7,000 left homeless. And the impact of that fire, I think, is still felt today in Hobart's community. You can see how the fires joined together. Ferntree wasn't a particularly good place to be that day. And the issue being that there were probably 4 fires impacted upon that location at that time. So it would have been incredibly difficult to determine which way to escape, which way to go. And if you're at home, and a lot of people were at that time, it would have been an absolutely dreadful position to be in. 67, that's what Wellington Park, Mount Wellington looked like, down through Strickland Avenue, etc. You can see not all the houses were burnt, but you can see that the impact upon the environment is quite profound. And it's interesting that in many streetscapes, the house-to-house ignition, as we all know, is the main source of house loss in major bushfires, just essentially cleaned whole streets out. We'll come to today. Let's think about today. Let's put it in a context that's probably relevant to us. I'm sure that many of you were present last season when we had some fires, 2 fires started that we were particularly concerned about. We had the Gel River fire, the major fires in the southwest, etc., and up in the Midlands. But in Hobart, the fires that I was particularly concerned about were 2. One at Glen Lusk, which started in the morning, and another one, a fire that started from a lightning strike at Tom Thumb, above to the northwest of Big Ben Fire Trail and the other side of Wellington Park. Wasn't a particularly bad day. It was a bad day, I suppose, but it wasn't outrageous. It wasn't catastrophic like 1967. Forest Fire Danger Index of 67, which is really into severe, but you've still got extreme and catastrophic to go, when a lot of the fires we talk about are in the catastrophic range, as was 2009. Winds 35, gusting 45. Yeah, look, just pretty strong wind, not a particularly pleasant day in February. It was 32 degrees and a relative humidity of 16%, not outrageous by any means. The modelling that we have now, the tools that we use in fire suppression, which is developed out of 2003 really and were widely used after 2009, is a program called Phoenix Rapid Fire. We use that for fire behaviour analysts. to predict the patterns of fire and where the pathways, etc., during major events. And I've used that to describe what these two fires would have done, which, the ignition points are chosen by a hand other than mine, and to see what could have happened. Now, this assumes no suppression, it assumes no fuel reduction works, it assumes no aircraft, no firefighters. It's simply the potential for these fires to expand under the forest fire danger algorithms that we have for predicting fire behaviour. As you can see, occurs about northwest of Glen Lusk, and another one at Tom Thumb. The running fire doesn't really do much for the first 2 hours, starts at 10 o'clock in the morning. Initially for 2 hours it stooges around, fires do that for you. About 12 o'clock it started to make a run, and as soon as the fire starts to make a run it generates its own weather, and it starts to generate not only a crown fire, depending on the conditions and the fuel, but also can throw embers ahead of itself in eucalypt forests like we have in Australia. The Firepath extends to the southeast very much in the same way that the 67 event did. It impacts upon human settlement areas, and it extends its impact beyond the bushfire-prone area. If you live doing development in Hobart, you'll know that there's a bushfire-prone area for the planning layer that impacts upon your application of the Australian standard. This fire extends its impact well beyond that boundary. It rapidly exceeds suppression potential. You just don't have enough gear and you can't get in the right place at the right time. And it reaches, strangely enough, Taroona by 1800 again. Now that's a product of the model, but it's 1800 in Taroona doesn't sound like a good place to be. This is at 12 o'clock when the fire starts to take a run, and the yellow outlines demonstrate the actual perimeter of the fire itself. And the important thing I draw your attention to are the red dots and the purple dots. The modelling for Phoenix Rapid Fire gives an ember throw model element that talks about topography and fuel type and weather, etc. And it has a randomly assorted ignition layer that says for every ember that's thrown out, a certain number will actually land on flammable ground. And it's really important to watch that because they essentially become the source of the pathway of the fire. This fire is starting to crown through eucalypt forests and throw bark and branches and leaves ahead of itself, which catch alight. Then those individual fires coalesce. And you can see that very early on, within 2 hours of commencement of the fire, you're already seeing embers into Hobart. So it would be not only with the smoke, but you'd have embers, and embers that remain alight, according to the model. As those fires coalesce, the yellow boundary of the fire itself starts to expand and throws more fire. You can see if you're on across the river, you're even now starting to experience embers from these fires that have joined together. It's interesting to see that the fire at Tom Thumb has wrapped itself around Mount Wellington in the pinnacle, and is in those extremely heavy fuels. We call them untreatable fuels. Heavy wet eucalypt forests, very heavy fuel loads, and the only time they'll burn is when it's very dry, after drought, and extremely dry period. The only time you can burn them in a prescribed burn is the same time. And I've had a reasonably successful career. I'm not about to try and do a hazard reduction burn in the heavy wet fuel forests of Wellington Park during the middle of a drought, thinking that I'm going to be able to hang on to it or hold it and keep it within the boundaries of the burn. And that, you'll see that is the biggest risk that we have in Hobart is these untreatable fuels on the mid-slopes and the lower slopes of Wellington Park. You can see that the fire now has extended its way all the way to Taroona. The yellow outline demonstrates that there's active fire fronts consuming fuels in Bicentennial Park, Ridgeway, etc., down through the Knocklofty. And you can see then it extends itself, it consolidates, those small fires coalesce, and you can see that the yellow outline, as the fire continues to consume the available fuel, impacting upon houses, impacting upon properties in semi-rural or peri-urban areas, and importantly, and I draw your attention to the fact that the ember attack has penetrated into the city itself. I'm sure that people who are living behind the university in Sandy Bay probably didn't really expect to see embers fall from the sky, burning brands from branches or or bark from the forest, but essentially that's what they're being confronted with in this model. You can see it then extends to the northwest, northeast and southwest. The fire's essentially continuing to burn and extend itself through available fuel. And importantly, you can see that areas in Sandy Bay, behind the university, have been hammered with burning embers. And that principle of ember attack is something that really isn't dealt with in terms of our current planning models, nor our planning schemes. And it's really difficult for an agency or a council or a large landholder distant from the city to do anything about that. It's a product of the vegetation and the fire behaviour. You can see as you go through, this fire essentially has now consumed all of the vegetation around the city. All of our great reserves have now been engaged in this fire, the top of Mount Wellington up until to the Alpine area, and continues to do that extension while ever fuel is available. You could do something about that. You could attack the flanks of the fire now with aircraft, etc. But it's also in pretty rough country, so difficult to get that. The worst thing you could have here now is a wind change. Anything with a northerly or westerly element in it would then drive that fire further down into the rest of the peninsula, take it down towards Kingborough, take it down into the Huon Valley. That image there just provides you with an idea of the amount of the embers that have been modelled from those two particular ignition points. And you can see they essentially cover all of the area of the final fire that will be impacted. So they move ahead of the fire quite quickly and create fires and define the impact of the final fire footprint. If you're in this part of the world, if you're looking at in terms of where we are now and that sort of edge, and it's just an idea, you can see the yellow outline being actual fire boundaries, and the penetration of embers into places like Sandy Bay or populated areas of the city is quite profound. It represents the current situation. That's a model of what the vegetation is based on current models. It's based on current fuel loads. It's based on current weather conditions and the state of art of our modelling of fire behaviour. It, I suppose, generates the perception that if a fire does start in those areas, very quickly the fire service is driven to the prime directive, which is to protect life. You can't protect houses under that scenario. You can only protect people, and even that may be extremely difficult. You might, as an incident controller, not deploy resources to a particular location simply because to do so would be to put your firefighters at risk of losing their own life. It may be that you just can't get in to do anything about it, and people are sort of left to their own devices. Tom Romania will talk shortly about the impact of climate change. The indication are that the modelling suggests that climate change will exacerbate these issues, that we'll have hotter days, more intense fires, and more frequently will they occur. We need to adapt to a changing landscape in terms of fire. We need to adapt to different ways of doing risk mitigation. We need to adapt as a community to the fact that fire will occur, and what are we going to do about that? And to be honest, I'll come back later at the session and show you what the city is doing and what the TFS are doing. But the message really is that individual property owners are really the solution to the threat that we have in front of us. Individual people making clear, sensible decisions in the cold light of winter, not when the sky's full of smoke, but have made decisions that allow them to survive. And that's what we're really talking about. As Lord Mayor has indicated, we do a significant amount of work in the city. We spend about $1.9 million a year in fire prevention, which is pretty profound for a local government to do that. We undertake fuel break construction. We maintain fuel breaks. We maintain significant length of fire trails to allow the fire service and ourselves to get in and fight a fire or to undertake hazard reduction burns. We clear vegetation on our land to protect individual neighbours' properties. I don't know any other landholder who does that. There's no legal requirement to do that, but we understand the risk that bushfire presents to the city, and we've done that work to make sure that we do our bit to ensure that we can put our hand on our heart when this day does come, that we've done the best we can to protect people. We do a lot of work of prescribed burning and mechanical treatment in areas where we can't burn it. That's not Wellington Park at the moment, but we're looking at different ways that we can achieve that. That's essentially what we're doing. And tonight will be more so about setting the scene, and importantly at the end I'll come back and have a talk to present to you what I think you can do to assist us to protect the community and yourselves and your properties.